This is my 2008 Dodge four-wheel drive 2500 with a 6.7 Cummins diesel on it. We've got it in the hangar here right now. Been doing maintenance on it. Kind of neglected it for a while. I was busy with other things. Finally decided it was fall and I was done with my summer work. It was time to get in here and get some stuff done. I drained the oil, changed it, put new oil filter on, and I've got a bypass oil filter. I changed it. Changed the air filter, fuel filter, and I greased the tie rod ends and the differential cardiac joint or whatever it's called that comes down from the transfer case down to the front differential, the drive line. I had these Yukon free spin hubs put on this spring, and when I put those on, I had new universal joints put in the axles on both sides, right and left, and they have zerts on them. They're greasable, so I had to grease those. And then I had new ball joints put in on the left side, and they're greasable, so I greased those. And we came in the interior and pulled the floor mats out and scrubbed the carpet out and cleaned it up, and cleaned up around the interior here, wiped it all down. And I go through all of these seals and clean out. They get the gaps here on the seals, and they get built up with crud in there, especially on the bottom. Clean those all out, and the ones on the bottom of the door, and that reduces the wind noise a lot. See, this is a pretty complex molding up here. It's got several channels in it that wind up collecting crud. And anyway, we got those all cleaned out, and put a new seat cushion in on the left seat. The original one was pretty crappy anyway, and it broke down within a year or two, and I took it into a place called Oregon Aero down in Scappoose, Oregon. And they build seats, pads for airplanes and heavy equipment and stuff like that with memory foam, and they built the seat up for me and put it back in, and that was pretty good for a couple of years, but it broke down too. And we go for long drives with the truck from Alaska down to the States, or from southeast Alaska up to Anchorage. Gets pretty hard on my back. So anyway, I got a new cushion and put in there, and that's pretty nice now. Then I had these, they're Indian blanket pattern seat covers. I put those on, cleaned up all the upholstery and put those on. I put the old Carcraft or Cabela's seat covers back over the top of them to protect them while we're working on the truck, and doing stuff there. And again, I cleaned up the door seals on the back door here, and pulled out the pads in the back here, and I had the new seat covers for the back seats, and they were pretty tough to get on the seat backs up here, the upper part of the backs, and you can't get behind them, and they don't fold forward. Seems like my old pickup, the seats backs folded forward, but these, they latched on. So it was easier to take the seats out and do them with them out than it was to try to do them with them in. So I got the seats out and the seat covers put on. We're going to leave the seats out for a little while. We're going to make a trip to Juneau and come back with some groceries and stuff when we come back, so we'll have it's more space in here without those seats in there. So here's the back seats. There's the left hand side one, that's the 40 one, I guess, and then the 60 one here. Seat covers are all on, ready to go back in. My left hand high beam light hasn't worked for a while. Several years ago, well, not long after I bought the truck, I got new mirrors for it. The standard mirrors on a Dodge truck suck. They're just lousy mirrors. They don't have much mirror space. They're more suited to a sports car than a pickup truck. You don't have much mirror to look back on. And then one of the goofy things they did on them was this convex mirror. They put out here on the outside where it blocks half of your vision from the big mirror, instead of putting it on the inside here where it's kind of out of the way and you can turn it to see a larger area. They put it out here on the main part of the mirror, which blocks the outer part of the mirror. So that's one of the things I did with the truck a year or so after I got it. It's got these aftermarket mirrors and put on, and they work a little better. They're still not as good as the big Ford mirrors. They're still pretty poor mirrors, but they're better than the factory ones. But they have these LED lights in them, both running lights or tail light, park light lights, and turn signals. We had to wire those up to work, and that required getting into the wiring harness and splicing into it. Well, the diagrams what they sent with the mirrors weren't for this truck. Colors were all different on it, and then when I found a wiring diagram for this truck, then the colors were still off on it. And I think that's what happened to my left-hand headlight. Is I tried to find the correct wire for attaching those turn signals to. When I found what I thought was the correct wires, I scraped off the insulation on it, and then I took the wires for the mirrors and just spliced them on and soldered them in. I didn't cut the wires, I just scraped the insulation off of them, which shouldn't have had any effect on anything, so it shouldn't have affected it. But that's when I started having trouble with the headlight. And I took it south one time into the shop, and they did something and got it working again for a while. But a year or so ago, it started flickering one evening and then went out completely. I don't know whether it was the tipm or whatever that thing is called, or whether it was just a broken wire. So anyway, I'm trying to research that to figure it out. Chrysler, in their infinite wisdom, took a perfectly good system of switches and relays and redesigned it into a computer system that manages the power for every system in the truck. And that's about as screwed up, stupid idea as they could come up with, because any little problem you get, any little voltage spike or anything else, screws everything up. And it runs everything in the truck, from the windshield wipers, the horns, the airbags, the air conditioning, the fuel pump, and the headlights, and the tail lights, and the trailer lights, every other damn thing in the truck. And so when it screws up, it can screw up royal, or if just one thing screws up, your whole truck is still down while you try to get it. You got to replace that thing, and it costs you $100 and some to get it checked out at a dealer, if you can find a dealer, and the nearest dealer here is about 1,200 miles away. And then it costs $800 or $900 or more to get a new board, because they can't fix them. And one of the things they've done, this is the headlight plug here. Hey, look at that. That's 16 gauge wire going to a headlight. And no wonder the headlights are dim on these damn things. You can't see anything at night. There's no way you can run enough amperage through a 16 gauge wire to put out enough lumens in a headlight to be effective. But that's what we got. So I've taken the module out to check the wires. I thought maybe it screwed up a pin or something when I had the wires out. But there's all these pins all look good. I pulled the board out just to look to see if I could find anything obviously wrong with it, and I traced down all of the circuit paths on there, and none of those are corroded or burnt. I don't see any problem with any of those. I don't see any here on the back on this board. I don't see any blown, obviously blown circuits in there, and the integrated circuits or the diodes or anything like that. It's kind of hard to tell unless there's something that's really fried, but I don't see any excess heat. Nothing showing any obvious physical signs of any damage. It was a little bit dirty, but there's no moisture damage. I can see some potential problems in it. Some of these solder joints, they left the resin on the solder joints. It didn't get cleaned up very well, quite a few of them. So there's some potential problem with corrosion there. But otherwise, everything looks pretty good. It's pretty clean. So I don't see a physical problem with this. I'll put it back together and put it back in there. And this is the headlight plug. It runs up in there. So I'm going to have to probably pull that battery out to see. It goes into that bundle, and I don't know whether it just turns back here or whether it goes somewhere else. It should just come to that TIMP module. What I wanted to do is just take this wiring harness and trace it down, just physically follow it to find the right plug. With this wire harness here, this goes the headlight, and then this is the running light. These all go together into one bundle up here, and then that goes through that fender and along the edge of that fender. You would think that it would just join this bundle right here and come out, but it doesn't. This major bundle goes back in along this fender behind the battery box. So I was going to try to open that up. I took the bolts out of the battery box to try to get it out of there so I could trace those wires down, get into that bundle. There's 4 bolts. There's 2 bolts here on this bracket and 2 on that bracket over there, and then there's a bolt on this TPIM module right here, and then there's a couple of bolts over there, kind of a shock mount for that must have something to do with the brakes, probably the ABS system. And I took those bolts out. Well, that thing didn't come out, didn't loosen up, so I got to investigating, and there's a couple of bolts that come through the fender from outside the fender into here. I looked at taking that fender liner out and getting those out, but that tray extends back over there underneath that that module over there, so that would be a pain in the ass to get it out. So getting this battery tray out is not really feasible for this job. A simple way of physically tracing that wire down through that bundle to find out which plug it went into just didn't turn out, so I have to go through the electric way of testing it with the ohm meter. I think I've got my problem figured out. It started just flickering on and off as we were driving here a while back, and then it went out completely. And it's just the left-hand high beam. A couple winters ago when we were coming back from Anchorage, it actually came on when it got down to about 35 below zero, which was kind of nice because we were driving up there. It's dark, long hours on the way back in the wintertime, and it was kind of nice having the high beams on so we could see out ahead far enough to see if there were any moose in the road or herd of caribou in the road ahead of us. Give us enough distance to see so we could stop in time if something was in the road ahead of us. And then after that, as soon as it warmed up, it quit working again, and I haven't been able to get it to work. So I've been tracing the wires out to see if there was an open in the wire between the headlight plug itself and the box here, the TIPM. What I found is that you can't trust the goddamn wiring diagrams on this thing, and wiring diagram here shows plug C coming out of there with the white and light green wire, and it comes down into a junction, and I figured out that that's where it just comes together and makes one cable. Oh, that's the headlight. So anyway, by looking at the plug here, you can see the white and green, white and light green, and then white and blue. And by taking a little piece of safety wire in there for a probe, this is the C plug here, and it has white and blue and white and green wires going into it. Well, when I plug into those, you get all kinds of ohm readings and the mega ohms and stuff like that, which isn't right. It should be dead short. And this one here has the gray one. It has a green and white, but that's a dark green, I guess. So anyway, this one here, this blue one, and it winds up being the F, I believe, plug. Anyway, that one had the green, light green, and white wire going to it. It doesn't have the light blue and white, or the blue and white wire going to it. So it just had the light green and white wire going to it. So it's on a different plug than what the one for the low beam is. So anyway, that's screwed up. But anyway, by looking at that, I could see that there was a problem with it. You can't see it as well here now. Maybe you can. But this middle pin, the number 4 pin, is the one that that ohmed out to the light bulb socket. And that pin, somebody had jammed something in there and elongated or oversized that socket. And so anyway, that's why it wasn't making contact. Let's see, where's the wire at? Here's the wire. It just has this little pin, And the pin, or the socket there, is actually a pretty good sized socket compared to the size of the pins that are in there. Let's see. You see those pins are pretty small size. So what I can see by looking at this is there's a small guide for that pin to go in there, and then this socket is oversized, but the top of the one side of the socket is bent over on the top of it, and kind of like a spring, so that that pin would fit tight against that. And with this one having been jammed in there with a probably electrical probe ohming that out, it opened that up to where it wouldn't make contact with that pin anymore. Now the right way to do that would be to get a new plug here and just replace the plug. The other thing that I thought about doing was taking, and there's only 4 pins in this, 5 pins in this that are being used, well 6 including the high beam, and so I could move this pin over into a different, or this socket over into a different socket in the plug, and then run a jumper between this pin here and one of the unused pins, and then jumper it. But that still wouldn't solve the problem, because this this socket right here, the main copper socket, is oversized, so it still wouldn't make contact. Another option, and one I'm still considering, is to take and solder a jumper wire onto this, where this this pin comes out right here and goes into the circuit board. I could solder a piece of wire onto that and bring it out through the side of the TIMPS, the case here, and then splice it into this wire somewhere, and that would bypass that pin. And that's still an option that I might take. And another option that I'm going to try is, I've got some copper foil, and I think I'm going to cut a thin strip of copper foil and stick down in that socket, and see if that'll be enough to reduce the size of that socket to where it'll make contact with that pin. Now this has got to be the stupidest bit of engineering I've ever seen, and I've worked on electronics for a long time, and this is just absolutely dumb. You've got 16 gauge wires running power to the headlamps, and there's no way you can run enough current through these wires to have a good headlamp, proper one. And then look at this, those pins. This is just a joke. I mean, that's like a micro circuit. It's just a joke. And it's cheap pins. It's cheap sockets and cheap pins. So this is just asinine to think that this whole board carries all of the circuits for the headlamps and the tail lamps and the running lamp, or the fog lamps, and the windshield wipers, and the air conditioner, and the airbags, and who knows what else on there. And it's just it's a microcircuit. Look at the size of these diodes, and you know, you run radios on that kind of stuff, or computers on that kind of stuff, but you don't run an automobile on that kind of stuff. So anyway, like I said, here's the top of the board, and that's the E pin, E socket, not the F one that headlight circuit, the high beam, goes through, and then the low beam goes through a different one. Well, I think I'm going to do a belt and suspender style fix on this. I did one of the things I said I was going to do. I took a piece of wire and soldered onto that pin that comes through the jack, and you could tell which pin it was because it's slightly discolored, probably from heating, from poor contact with that plug, if it was shorting or arcing in that plug. or a poor connection, it would overheat or heat that pin up. So you can see it's slightly discolored. I don't know whether you can see that or not, but anyway, it's slightly discolored compared to the other ones. They're pretty bright and shiny. So I took a piece of I don't know whether that's 16 or 18 gauge wire and wrapped around the corner of that pin where it bends and goes out of the plug or out of the jack and into the terminal block into the PC board, and then I soldered it on there, and it was just a quick solder job. This is my solder gun I've had for about 45 years. It's just like the ones I used to use in the Air Force. It's a little too big for most of this real fine work. Well, it's quite a bit too big for this work on these PC boards, but for that there it worked just fine. The wire is aircraft grade wire, so it can stand a little more heat than quite a bit more heat than a standard hardware store, auto quality, Harbor Freight, whatever wire of the same gauge. And it's pre-tinned. It's copper wire. It's pre-tinned. So I cut off a clean section and stripped a clean section of it, wrapped around that, put a little bit of flux on that pin, wrapped it around there so it was good and tight, and then I just held the soldering iron on the wire until it warmed up enough that solder would flow, and it warmed up just enough to heat that pin up just enough to make a good solder contact on that pin. Then there's a little pocket. There's molded in pockets in these plugs, in these jacks. They don't go all the way through, but they don't. There's no other function for them other than just probably rigidity of the jack. So I took a drill bit, drilled that one out enough, run that wire up through it, and then that'll come out into the engine compartment underneath that case for this, and the plug will go in here, and then there's plugs in each one of these. Now these plugs are color coded, but the plugs themselves are color coded, and then there's a color on the case where it fits over this jacks, and to correspond with the color of the plug. But it's not really, it just makes it a little bit faster because each one of these receptacles is polarized. They're all slightly different so that you can't mix them up. There's no way to mix them up. This jack here, this plug here, is similar to this one here, has the same number of pins, the same row of pins, but the jack, the socket for it is different. This one has 3 flanges down here, and anyway, they're just different enough that there's no way that you can mix them up. So that's a good thing for those of us that are a little bit ham-handed. So I'm going to take that back and put this thing back together, put the shell back around it, and then I'm going to go ahead and do like I said earlier. I'm going to take some of that thin copper foil that I have and go ahead and put it in the socket for this pin, and to try to fill it out a little bit so it'll make contact with that pin, and then I'll go ahead and splice this wire into it. So as I said, it's a belt and suspenders type of fix. One of them doesn't work, the other one will, and sure as hell won't hurt anything to do that. So that's the plan, Stan. Well, I've put this plug back together, and I'm going to put it back, everything back together. Now I'm going to have to get some electrician's tape and tape all this stuff back up, but into bundles, but should be able to put it back together again. So you can see, I don't know what this hole, middle hole right here was the one that was hogged out, and then somebody stuck a probe down in there and just hollowed it out, hogged it out. So hopefully I've got it fixed. It might be kind of redundant with that wire, but what I did, I tried using a piece of thin foil and bending and sticking in there, but with my ham-handed fingers and stuff, I just couldn't quite get it to work. Well, I come up with an alternative plan. I took some strands of wire and bent them into a little J-hook and slid one end down into the inside of that receptacle, that socket, and then put the other side over the back side of it there to kind of a hook. And there's a little pocket in there that separates those pins, so that's not going to short out against the other pin. And then this this white plastic piece here is kind of a retainer that comes out, and when that slides back in, that covers that pin up, and that'll hold those pieces of wire in. Now I tried that first with a piece of wire off of a 10 gauge wire, and I thought that was just a little bit too thick. Oh, I found a 14 gauge wire, and the strands in it, the wire strands in it, are quite a bit thinner, so I just used 2 of those in there, and hopefully that'll make good contact with that pin. I'll get those wire bundles the wires all bundled back up and taped up and put it back together. Well, I've got all of the wires bundled back up and taped up. I might have made a mistake from taping those all up tight like that. Sometimes they have those wires out in the air, so they get open instead of bundled up, so they get more air circulation around them and don't concentrate the heat up in them. They're also not quite as stiff. Those are pretty stiff now, but they're in there. We'll see how that goes. Now I took that headlight wire, and I've got this one that I tapped into the inside of that plug, the jack, and I tapped it into the wire on the outside. Now I never did like these kind of taps, the ones that you just squeeze on and have kind of an alligator clamp type thing. But I found these, they're new to me, probably not new, but they're new to me, but they're just a single clamp on there, and they clamp on the wire, and then you can use a spade connector to slide the wire in, so you can disconnect the wire without having to take the clamp off and then exposing the raw edges. So that thing is all together. Now we'll try to put it in there and see if we can get it in with all those wires bundled up like that. Well, everything's back together, and lo and behold, the high beam light works. So it wasn't the tip unit at all, or what is it, tipm unit at all. It was the wire, the plug. So anyway, there's the high beam. It's working, and there's the tipm back in there. Battery all hooked up. So I put the cover on that and did a couple of tie wraps back in there that I cut. All that is all ready to go. All back together. Okay. Both high beams work. So